It's an honor to be here at the Southern Center, and my former friend Steve Sokol, who's the Deputy Director at the American Council on Germany, and I say former friend jokingly, he's a very close friend of mine, but he took me at my word. I said, our book has come out into a second edition, and it's a good excuse to go home. I don't want to go to New York. I don't want to go to Washington, which is where I always go, and I counsel others not to, because you don't get an idea of what's going on out in the country. They're not terribly representative of anything. I spent 10 years living in Washington, so I speak from bitter experience. I said, I want to go see all your other chapters and fill it up, since I'm going to be over for about a week and a half. Fill it up as much as you want. And the day before I left, I run a consulting firm, and my German colleagues were giggling, and I came into the hallway. I said, what's so funny? And they said, have you seen the itinerary for this trip? And I said, no, I left it to Steve. And there are 16 gigs in 10 days. There are, when I do find him, I either will hug him or throttle him. I haven't decided which. It has been great to be home. And it has been great to get out of Washington. And it has been great to talk to an awful lot of people. And the book is a great platform to talk to people. And I hope we have a discussion. And I was going to make a more formal speech, and I will keep these remarks, I hope, blessedly brief. I will do it like a Washington briefing, meaning I hope with some edge, and I hope I provoke you, because there isn't enough provocation in our field. There's way too much consensus, which is one of the reasons we wrote the book. Anatole and I came to the conclusion that although he was a leading Democrat and I a leading Republican, that the problem about basically the way Washington worked was that, like the Sharks and the Jets, we fought over turf, but ideologically there weren't a lot of differences between the leading Democrats and the Bush administration. Now, what did we mean by this? Because that's a great slogan, but what did we mean? We mean that the Democrats made a fatal kind of intellectual error. They think they went to better universities than the Republicans and can run the Republican program better by speaking more nicely to the rest of the world, as though that were our basic problem. I was just at a meeting over Russia with very leading people around Jeff Sachs, who of course got us into this mess to some extent in the first place. And no sense that they were involved, no sense that they had anything to do with the problem. But obviously the neocons' statecraft is terrible. They're right. And so we will learn to talk to the Russians in a language that they like, and they will come back to doing what we want. And I sat there and said, I'm leaving this meeting. This is a madhouse. I must be taking crazy pills. Because that is not the problem. The Russians are not children it's merely the way that we talk to them that's the problem. And anybody who thinks you can go back to the 90s as though the last 8 years had not happened needs to read a piece I wrote yesterday in the Los Angeles Times. Was that a good segue or what? I wrote a piece with a friend of mine, a young friend, good young, very angry young man, looking at American choices in the post-Cold War era from the perspective of the Corleone crime family. The hinge of the movie is, of course, when the Don is attempted, they attempt to whack Brando. And the three brothers come in, Tom Hagen, the adopted brother, Sonny, and Michael, come into the room and have this argument. And the hinge of the movie is, what do they do now that Brando may die and has certainly been injured by forces he doesn't understand? 9/11. The three brothers have three very different views for how to run the world. The key point is that Sonny and Tom, who hate each other, who don't agree about anything, Sonny would say Tom is a weakling. Tom would say Sonny is a thug. They both would be right. But they share a certain view of the world, which is the Don's primacy is beyond question. If we just kill everyone, Sonny's neoconservative view is, we will remove all doubt from what goes on. Tom says if we just talk nicely to everyone, because of the power that the Don has, everyone will fall into line. But they still believe in a world that has passed. Michael, as a realist, is the only one who says, even my father knows his days are ending, and we must look at the world differently, and for the survival of all that we hold dear, recalibrate what's going on. And that's what Washington is about. The Democrats just think we can go back to the 90s, read Hillary Clinton's Foreign Affairs article, listen to the people around Barack Obama. We will go back to the good days, blame it all on hapless George W. Bush, and go back to making things work the way they did, as though the rise of the BRICS had not happened, the subprime mortgage crisis had not happened, the $1 trillion plus spent on Iraq had not happened, as though America were in the same structural position it found itself in back in the 90s. You cannot make a policy work if you base it upon delusion. It will fail. We know that Sonny's view of the world, that you see a certain amount of ambiguity in the world and you try to kill it. is not a way to proceed. That the world is not, as the Romans said of the Mediterranean, mare nostrum, our sea, us and the barbarians. That's what we're dealing with. That hasn't worked. And even the neocons are moving back slightly, trying to save what's left of their careers, and I hope we don't let that happen. But they are moving back from that position. But the democratic Tom Hagen view we found to be equally delusional because it was not based on the power realities of the world that we live in today. New thinking is called for, and new thinking based on a world that actually exists and not one that we might like to have happen. And that's the basis of the book that we wrote. How do the Germans see all this? I'm going to quickly go through, and it will be somewhat soundbitey so that we can have you talk more than me. And when I was in California, I was out at Monterey for a conference, and I tried to make my points into the good, the bad, and the ugly, but it didn't work. So it's the good, the bad, the difficult, and the supremely important. The good is the Germans actually, for once, have a degree of specificity about what they don't like. For a long time, it hasn't been specified. But our election has helped. And let me say, when you walk down the street in Germany, I write for a lot of German papers, and the Germans have an old-fashioned system. They put your picture next to your byline, and so everybody knows what you look like. And as I walk down the street in Kreuzberg, large hulking Germans who never quite got their PhD tap me on the shoulder with 6 days beard and say, "Are you indeed that American who writes on our elections?" And I somewhat defensively say, "Yes, I think so." And they say back to me, "What about the superdelegates after North Carolina and Indiana?" The level of their knowledge is extraordinary because they finally figured out that if they don't like what's happening in America, they better find out how the system actually works. And every single German I know can explain to you the superdelegate problem and the democratic voting system, which, as we were saying, resembles nothing so much as the Fourth French Republic. I mean, only, I speak as a Republican who needs the neocons to go away, and as I say to my Democratic friends, will your death instinct outweigh the fact that this should be a tap-in putt for you guys? And my Democratic friends say, don't rule out the death instinct. So I'm going on that point. So the Germans know what they want. They want a multilateral way of dealing with the world. And by this, they actually can be somewhat specific. Bush 1 was fairly unilateralist. Let's leave it there. Bush 2, where there has been some learning, still doesn't get them to where they want to go. Bush 2, the second Bush term, has been, we will come up with a decision amongst ourselves. We will then ask the allies what they think of it. And if they don't like it, we will again, without them, come up with a decision and then ask them if they like it.
Oh, wait, by Bush 1, you mean
his first term, as I said,
not
yes.
his father's term.
That's correct. The second Bush term has shown learning. It is not the same as pure unilateralism, but it is not multilateral in the sense that they are involved as stakeholders in making decisions on policy, and that is what they want, very clearly. They know the issue. If they have the way of doing things, they have the issue. The issue is Kyoto. In Germany, this is totemic for all kinds of other things. A post-Kyoto protocol is the issue that they think most important in every poll you look at. And if any American administration comes in that doesn't deal with Kyoto, this will be seen as a disaster. The Chancellor has co-opted the Green Party strategy in making this the centerpiece of what's left of her foreign policy agenda, and there isn't a whole lot left. But that is certainly part of it. And they see this as totemic for a lot of other things about the United States not listening that matter to them. So if they have a way of doing things and they have an issue, they also have a man, and it is a man. It's Obama. If the Germans could vote, Obama would overwhelmingly win. My Juncker boss, with the monocle, the whole thing, who is one of the stiffest-necked people I've ever met in my life, warmed to me that he said, "You have met Obama? Did you shake his hand?" And I said, "Well, we weren't dating, but yes, I did shake his hand." He just ignored the dating comment and went on and said, "Oh, he does Afghanistan. That's very good." And he was happy with me for like weeks. That is very common. The reason is in Germany, they desperately want to turn the page. And when you look at Germany, I live 2 blocks from Tempelhof. You think of Truman every time you walk by. When you drive by the Rathaus on the way into my work, every cab driver who figures out you're an American says Kennedy. And when you go by various sections of the wall, Reagan is invoked. American presidents linger around that city, unlike almost any other city, I think unlike any other city I've ever lived in Europe. And they see Obama as a guy who can make the Kennedy speech, turn the page, have 500,000 people show up, and then we go back to the fat old Tom Hagen days. Does this sound familiar? They think we can turn back the clock too. And they hope desperately for all the goodwill in the world that we can. Here's the bad, if that's the good then. Let's do the Obama thought experiment, which is something I write about. Say that, and Obama's people have asked me, well, what should we do? And I said, go to Europe, don't just go to London, go to Paris, go to Berlin, go to Warsaw, go to Madrid, go to Rome, do a whole tour, show that you're not just talking to the British, that's vital, but go talk to them and don't have a laundry list, typical Democratic problem, have specific issues that you can operationalize pretty quickly. And use this goodwill with the door open to get some things done, because boy, it's been a long time since we've agreed and actually solved a common problem of global governance. And if we don't, the alliance won't stay together if it never solves any problems. Let's do the Obama thought experiment. Say Obama takes my advice. And so after the 500,000 people and the parties, I come in with a glass of wine. And by the way, I feel like Peter O'Toole at a press conference here with my glass of wine. It's fantastically good. If I slide under the chair, someone pick me up. It's been a long day. This is my third one today. No, third speech. I should do a speech, a glass of wine. That's exactly what I should charge Steve. I love that. That's my new rate of pay, I think.
And then you could debate yourself.
I often do in the plane. But let's do the Obama thought experiment. Say I stop drinking wine and I have myself a coffee and we come in Monday morning and I'm invited in to have Obama talk to the chancellor. What would he say? He would say something like this. Look at the policies he has espoused. He would say, I'm a multilateralist and I believe in a multipolar world and I agree with you. We have to do a lot more together. You are right that we've got to involve you in decisions right up front. Kyoto is vitally important. I agree with you and I'm glad that you support me and I think we can move forward. Now to business. Afghanistan. We have to have a common counterinsurgency policy that takes into account all the domestic and developmental needs you mentioned. You are correct. We must wed that to a military policy. That's the only time counterinsurgencies ever work. And by the way, they almost never work. Name me counterinsurgencies that have worked. Malaya, El Salvador, after tremendous bloodletting and horrible things happening in both cases. By the way, any counterinsurgency, name me one where horrible things didn't happen. Perhaps we should think of that before we engage in counterinsurgency. Find me an example where there wasn't one, where there were significant human rights violations. You can't, historically. So let's say we get lucky. We'll put all these pieces together. We'll involve you in the beginning. We'll do development. We'll do hearts and minds. We'll do trade and aid. And then I want troops in the South. Because we have to share risk. That's what NATO is about. And I need troops in the South where there's fighting and not troops guarding New Jersey where there's not a lot of fighting in the North, which was pacified by the CIA and some particularly ruthless warlords who do have legitimacy in the region, unpalatable as that is to mention. They certainly do. That's what we need. Trade. I got into real trouble on trade because I had to lie and say that my advisor who went to Canada didn't say something that he actually said, which is ignore what I'm saying about NAFTA. Of course we agree with everything you say. We need to do more free trade, but 90% of my party is protectionist, which is exactly the truth. Let's remember NAFTA was passed with Republican votes and about 15% of the New Democrats. Okay? And Bill Clinton, being the magician he is, got the credit to the consternation of Newt Gingrich. But it wasn't Democratic votes. And they're certainly more protectionist than at any point since the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. I defy anyone to look at the Senate races last time and the coming up races and contradict that. So Obama says we've got to move forward on trade. We have a development round. That's what we promised them. Financial services don't help the people in Mali and Ghana. They want to trade in maize and wheat and soybeans and things they actually make rather than financial services that perhaps they don't make. And if we don't do this, we will look like we are yet again letting down the developing world. So the only way to move forward is ag reform, meaning we can't do that on our own and you can't. We've got to make compromises and move all at once. So I need you, Angela, to reform the common agricultural policy after 40 years of saying you will and doing very little. Because we're multilateralists and we agree. Third point is Iran. I totally agree with you. Bombing would be an unmitigated strategic disaster. To avoid that and avoid Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon, we must have, conversely, a much harder stick from Europe. And sanctions aren't going to do it. There's no way we can get the Gulf states, Russia, and China on board. Significant sanctions. The good news is the mullahs can't run an economy. They have to create 500 to 625,000 new jobs a year, given their demographic bubble. The only thing we can do that is measurable is draw a bright line and say, an investment freeze. And that means in Europe, German banks and Italian banks will stop investing immediately in Iran. We will then bring on board the Gulf states, Russia, and China. But we will start with Europe and America. And that is the only way we can have a stick, rather than surrendering and allowing Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. And because we are good multilateralists, we don't want bombing to be on the table, so I need you to do something here. And Mrs. Merkel will look at her shoes. And Richard Pearl will crawl out from whatever rock he's hiding behind and say to guys like me, you see, working with them is a waste of your time because nothing gets solved, because global governance is not moved forward, because the Europeans look at us as though they were watching a movie. It is passive. They like it, they don't like it, but they do not feel involved in a policy-oriented direction. And without being involved in a policy-oriented direction, why in the world are you wasting your time when these problems will not be solved without their active engagement? This will play directly into our domestic political scene, and that is the great fear. It is not enough to say these things that you like. I like motherhood too. You must give me policies. You must tell me what to do, how to do it, with what mechanisms, over what period of time, and if you don't do that, you are simply not being serious. So what do? The difficult. What do we do if the Obama thought experiment works? There's one more thing that's difficult in this. Let's look at the issues. Even Kyoto, which should be an open door, and by the way, I advise them to work on Kyoto. You could probably get this done. But you would need standards to be set that would be individually met. There could not be one way forward, which is the European Union method of doing business. We will follow one sort of road map to do it. That certainly won't happen. It's not how Americans think and work. We will set certain targets, then they have to be met. How the countries choose to meet them will be up to them. The Europeans, when they signed this thing, how many people know how many countries have lived up to the Kyoto Protocol in Europe? One. Nobody. And as the Italian foreign minister at the time said to me, why don't you sign the damn thing, John, and ignore it? That's what we do. And I said, well, I'm an Anglo-Saxon. He said, but that is stupid. And I said, I have a moment of clarity here about our problems. If we sign an agreement, they must live up to it. It can't, well, things are difficult, blah, 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 blah. No, that has to be in the deal. And third, it has to involve India and China. We will not commit economic suicide. No president. I talked to Joe Biden about this 2 weeks ago. He said, no, I couldn't possibly sign it and survive if I were president. The Democrats, as well as the Republicans, need India and China on a gradated basis. Nobody's saying at the same rates we are. Nobody's saying they can't develop. But they must be involved in negotiation, or there simply is no deal. So even there, we have to talk specifically, not that we love the environment or we love polluting, but how we actually do this. I think that's doable, and I think that's the most hopeful one. But it's not easy. It's still difficult. And then secondly, and most importantly, the way of doing business. The multilats are all on life support. None of them are working very well. The World Bank is in terrible trouble. People wonder if it needs to exist. Doha and the World Trade Organization isn't working. The UN is certainly not functioning. On Rwanda, should I run the list? North Korea, Iraq, Iran, is it doing what the founders thought it would do? Of course it's not. Why? They don't reflect the power realities of 2008. Any of the institutions. And until they reflect the power realities of the world we live in, they won't work very well. Okay? So the slogan in Europe is we will reform things institutionally. Like motherhood, that's a lovely slogan. But what does that mean? Using what mechanism, who makes the decisions, with what money, over what period of time to do what function? That's an argument. Without saying that, saying you want to reform them, which is usually in Europe where every conference ends, not begins, is simply not enough and is not serious. I do want to reform them. But that means Europeans are going to have to grasp the nettle as Americans do. Americans are going to have to look at a world and say, integrating the BRIC economies, the rising powers, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and the others, into a Euro-Atlantic norms-based system, if we can, is the single overriding strategic challenge of the next 35 years. That is what matters. Nothing else does as much. If these countries are integrated into this norms-based system, if they are status quo powers rather than revolutionary powers, put statues up to all of us, do biographies of all of us, we will live in a much more humane and just world. If they don't, and we fail, and they become revolutionary powers outside of the system, tearing it down, we live in the jungle, and with them gaining in power relative to us and the Europeans. That's what matters. And no one's talking about this. No one's serious. Do you hear this in the election, or the German election, or the French election? No. And that's the only thing that matters. To live in this world, a different mindset must be created. From an American point of view, and what I love about our book is we talk about choices needing to be made, not laundry lists. These are the two American problems. Read the Princeton Project. It's a laundry list of every possible positive outcome. We were worried about our book about this, challenging it until I read it, and I said, don't worry, Anatole, it's not a problem. They make no choices at all. Motherhood, women's rights, human rights, stability, economic growth, political growth, as though these were not contradictory at times. Think of Iraq. My favorite moment in working in the Council on Foreign Relations, and I worked on their Iraq project, was the two spearheads of our program on what to do about Iraq after the war were promoting women's rights and stability by dealing with Grand Ayatollah Sistani. I had this great image as we worked on this of us going through the teeming streets of Najaf. He won't meet with us directly. That's already a problem, Sistani. But through intermediaries, we say, we really need your help with Muqtada al-Sadr, stabilizing Shia support for the invasion so that we can get the heck out of here. But by the way, if you don't adopt our Western standards of women's rights and do it immediately, I'm going to shake my finger at you. But can you help us now, please? That no one would see that as contradictory in the immediate term. Timing of issues, importance of issues, choosing what you do on issues is utterly lacking. Partly it's our graduate school problem. I remember being in American graduate school and having to list all the causes of slavery. If you didn't list, I think there were 27 we had to memorize, our catechism. If you didn't list them all, you were marked down. So we're all very good at making lists. Are they all equally important? Implicitly in a list, you're saying they are. If you don't make those choices, you don't say, this is vital, this would be nice, and this would be in a perfect world a really good thing to do, but I don't live in a perfect world. None of that is present in American thinking in Washington, and it's because of our system. The other problem is the 1890s, and in our book we talk about this. These choices have to be made. We're a lot like Britain in 1890. They're rising peer competitors. The United States, Japan, and Germany are rising. You're still first among equals. You're in relative decline, but the British were in relative decline for 200 years and still ran the world. I mean, get over that being a terrible thing. How do you actually make things work? And what you simply do is this. You say, we're not going to fight, the British say, we're not going to fight the Americans in the Western Hemisphere anymore over demarcation lines in Venezuela and Colombia, which they did in the 1880s, 1890s. You know, that's a loser. We have huge economic interests in Latin America, but the Americans are going to run the hemisphere. We're going to play a big role. We are omnipresent in the world, but we are not omnipotent. And we will be the second or third greatest power, and we'll try to work with them. After the Russo-Japanese War, the British do the same thing in Asia. They say, obviously Japan's on the rise. We're going to have to engage with them. We're going to have to try to work with them as we go. They didn't do so well with Germany in Europe. But aren't they glad they bothered thinking differently come 1918 in the Ludendorff Offensive, when the United States and Japan out in Asia come to their aid because they thought differently 28 years before. That's how foreign policy ought to work. That's how foreign policy needs to work. So we need to stop laundry listing, and we need to make real choices. When we wrote our book, every area specialist said to us, I love your book. You're right, we need to make choices in the rest of the world, except in our area where we're going to tell those people what to do. And that is exactly the bureaucratic fantasy that we're living in. Every area specialist will say, you're right, choices need to be made, except in what I do, and following that logic, no choices will be made at all collectively. We will still think the same way. We will just tell everyone what to do. We have no limits on our power. We still can in our areas if you add them all up. Do that, though in theory what you're saying is very nice. Anatole and I used to look across the room and smile every time this happened, and it happened plenty of times. This is an entirely different way of thinking about the United States. Entirely different and utterly necessary for the world we live in. The Europeans have to make 2 points as well. One, if the BRICS are the rising countries, you know, it's an awkward term, the Goldman Sachs term, and there are a lot of differences. And I'm not using it academically, make it the rising powers, but let's just take Brazil, Russia, India, and China for a minute. What do they have in common? Not a lot, but one thing. They are more Westphalian than the Americans. The European model is not ruling the world. This Mark Leonard fantasy is utterly wrong. Brazil, Russia, India, and China want non-interference in their sovereign affairs. That they all believe in. They want less of a role for international institutions that they see as Western and bullying them. They want more sovereignty being respected and more of the nationalism that they espouse being respected. As I say to Europeans, the reality is that for all the things you dislike about America, we tend to be more unilateral and more nationalistic. Guess what?
They're more unilateral and nationalistic than we are, and they're rising. You aren't the future. The future is the Westphalian nation-state. That's not what one says in academia, but it's certainly the truth. And as a result, you're going to have to work with us because you don't have any other options. Secondly, to live in this multilateral world the Europeans want to live in, if they want these institutions to reflect reality, what needs to happen? They must have a correspondingly smaller role in them. Meaning, if you power weight these institutions, Europe is dreadfully overrepresented. If you want the permanent five of the UN Security Council to matter, you need India in, certainly. You need to have Brazil in, South Africa, Egypt, you can argue about, and you need a European seat and not the British and the French. I will believe in the European Union far more when the European Union has a seat at the permanent five and not the French and the British. And I can see the scratch marks on the wall as we lead the French ambassador away. They're not going to give up their seats. And until they give up their seats, and this approximates reality, they will not see that if they want to live in the world that they talk about wanting to live in, a multilateral world where international institutions function, where a multipolar system is functioning with some forms of rule of law, that means correspondingly they will have a lesser role to get the world that they want. I hear none of this. And yet without hearing that, these institutions will continue to limp along, and time will write about them all as though they had nothing in common. That takes an entirely new way of thinking as well. So why does any of this matter? You know, why does this story of doom and gloom matter? Because do this. Do the thought experiment again on the issues, but do it without starting with the Euro-Atlantic Agreement. Europe and the United States alone, certainly we've learned, is not essential to solving all our problems. Europe and the United States is probably not essential to solving most of our global governance problems. But you know what? Try to solve a problem in your head without Europe and the United States. Can we do a trade deal? No. Can we do Kyoto? No. Can we work through interests on Afghanistan? No. Can we deal with an Iranian policy that is different but is short of bombing? No. In the end, we find ourselves thrown back together, even in this complicated, very different world where we must learn to live with limits, where we must learn to make choices and argue about choices internally because it's ethical and practically the thing to do as well. And we must realize that we are stuck with one another. And I would close with the notion, I was talking to the Honorary Council. I had to write a piece for the Daily Telegraph a few years ago on very short notice. And I thought, well, okay, I'll try to get it in. And I usually try to write empirical pieces. This was definitely not going to be an empirical piece. This was an impressionistic effort because I had an hour to get it done beginning to end. And I thought, what is the transatlantic relationship really like? And I said, to me it reminds me nothing so much as the Rolling Stones in about 1968. You have Mick Jagger and Keith Richards having these terrible fights over Anita Pallenberg, the Swedish model. And by the way, if you're going to break a band up, a Swedish model seems a really good reason to do that. I think at least for once they're fighting over values that matter. And of course, Mick and Keith knew each other when they were 4 and 5 years old. They had the same kindergarten teacher, a fact that obsesses me. I want to meet this woman someday and hear her stories. And Mick said to Keith, after, this may indeed be apocryphal, it's in a book without a footnote, but I certainly hope this story is true. They had a fist fight over Anita, and Mick finally says to Keith, it's over between us, man. We just don't share values anymore. I can't work with you. It's done. Keith finds this funny and lights his fingers on fire and starts smoking them. Mick is enraged that Keith finds this amusing and is having a cigarette. And he says to him, didn't you hear me, man? We just don't see eye to eye anymore. I'm through with you. And Keith Richards said a profound geostrategic thing. He said, listen, darling, it's bigger than the both of us. I've listened to your solo work, and it's not going to cut it. You can't do anything without me, and I can't do anything without you. And practice is at 9 in the morning. And that's where we are. Practice is a deed for the United States at Europe at 9 in the morning. So let's get on with it. Thank you.
Well, nothing but provocative, and as a debating champion, we expected nothing less. Thank you. There is one area that you've left out, and before I open it up, I would like to just put it to you and then step back, and that is that whole area of the war on terror, of Al-Qaeda, how to deal with it, which segues, of course, into the rise of militant Islam and the role that plays, which also has on the side the Palestinian conflict. Because in each of these, very definitely the Europeans, and certainly the Germans and the United States on the other hand, see things differently, although we have to remember that Al-Qaeda was very much part of the Hamburg sort of genesis of a lot of the plots that have been addressed, that they are very much concerned and have been very much victims of Al-Qaeda, just as the United States was on only one occasion, fortunately. So where do we come together on that? Where is the pragmatism and the realism, the ethical that you're talking about?
Well, the first thing to say is the Germans didn't get nearly enough credit for helping on Hamburg. After the Al-Qaeda attack, rather than finger pointing and saying this is your fault or whatever, we began to work through with the Germans what happened in Hamburg. And one of the interesting things we found out about Al-Qaeda is it doesn't operate like other terrorist groups. I mean, when the Bolsheviks needed money, Stalin knocked off a bank. He was quite a successful bank robber in his youth. The OAS in France did the same. ETA make passports for all the terrorist groups of the world. The IRA sell mortars. They do illegal things to make money. And as a result, sometimes they get caught. They get attention drawn to themselves. It's not how Al-Qaeda function at all. They tend to function within societies. Their passports were in order. Their working papers were in order. They're the nice, quiet guy at the end of the street who has funny people coming in and out late in the nights. But they don't make a fuss and they don't violate the law. They work within institutions and within systems. Entirely different modus operandi. The only way we really know how this works is by the Germans sharing intelligence with us and what they learned after the fact in Hamburg. And this is a great success for which they got no practical credit at all. But there is a lot of cooperation for all the differences in the war on terror. I think one has to give them great credit there. I mean, as to militant Islam, I'd say yes, they're unhappy with the phrase war on terror because they don't see it as a war primarily, and this is a difference. We can argue, does this theoretically matter or not? They certainly think it does. And they would say that part of this is about hearts and minds. It's a longer-term strategy. I said we call the Cold War the Cold War. Certainly that had a big impact. But they see saying the war on terror as showing a huge emphasis on the military at the expense of the policing, the intelligence, and the developmental aspects of this. Whether that's true or not, certainly the emphasis is different. They are correct as far as that goes. But for them, there's another issue, which is radical Islam from within. I mean, as the mayor of Rotterdam said to me once, he said he was patiently listening to DHS talk about terrorism. I could tell he was bored. He was playing with his pen. And he went out for a cigarette. And I've learned that you learn a lot from Europeans, and I don't smoke, but I bum them off them so I can go and sit out them. That's my Lawrence of Arabia effort. I'll do what they do, and they'll be so grateful an American has a cigarette that they'll often talk to me. And so I'll smoke half a cigarette and stub it out, and they're so pleased that someone's joining them out in the parking lot behind a tree that they'll talk to me. And one of the things they said was, look, John, this is all interesting, but your concept of the war on terror is to fight it as far away from America as humanly possible. Afghanistan is an ideal location for you. You don't want to fight it in the Golden Gate Bridge, New York, Washington, etc. For us, we have a problem that is internal that we fear, which is the non-assimilation of large Muslim societies in Europe themselves. And as he said, I'm the mayor of Rotterdam, and the #1 name for baby boys born in my town last year is Mohammed. And the mayor of Amsterdam said he thought it was Osama, but he wasn't sure. But it was up there. It was in the top 3 or 4. He said, we see this as a policing problem, a society problem, an assimilation problem, an acculturation problem, and all that's important and vital, but it's an internal problem. It's a different kind of way of dealing with the same phenomenon, whereas you want to deal with it out in Afghanistan, we would rather deal with it in Rotterdam. And we're not going to see eye to eye because we simply structurally have a different position. I thought that was an extremely sensible thing to say. I think he's right. As to the Palestinian issue, yes, we disagree. Yes, they think every American is incredibly pro-Israeli to a ridiculous extent, and we think that they have no conception of Fatah or Hamas or Arafat, and we complain at cocktail parties about each other. But let's start from the notion that I think our differences can be good in the long run for the Palestinian crisis, and we say this in the book. There is no deal that will ever be accepted by the Palestinians without the Europeans being in the room and without guaranteeing a boatload of money. There is no deal without that. There is no deal on the Palestinian issue from the Israelis without the Americans being in the room and guaranteeing security-wise the state of Israel. So, if the Europeans and the Americans, from their differences, can coordinate common positions, we are indeed the two right forces to have leverage on the partners at the table. Notice I said leverage and not tell them what to do. Part of the problem is they must be made stakeholders in their own settlement. They must take the lead in their own settlement, or it simply won't hold beyond the moral imperative that everyone ought to take imperative in their own settlements. If this is seen as an American diktat, it won't last, and there'll be irredentists on whatever side to undo it. They must want it more than we do. We must help, we must facilitate, we must be creative, and if there are questions about that, I'd love to talk about. We have a Middle East peace plan in there. The way that the thing is done, I think confidence building has failed. It's been an honorable failure, the Oslo process, but the Palestinians are too traumatized to go first. They simply can't make concessions, hoping to get a state someday down the road. No Palestinian political leader could physically survive till the evening if they did that. On the other hand, the Israelis, and I think people underestimate this in Europe, are too traumatized to go first either. These virtual peace plans that say, you make all the concessions and then someday down the road maybe you'll get peace, is not a winner electorally in the state of Israel. We must all go at once. We must all act together. Everyone must get just enough that they will make the tough concessions that they need to move forward. But I don't think that Oslo has had a very good track record, to put it mildly. The good news is that we, by our differences, are the two people that need to be in the room. And so sometimes our differences are actually policy blessings in disguise, I think.
Thank you on that. Let's open it up for discussion. Yes, John.
I don't know if we're Dr. Hulsman or
John. John's fine.
I like the title of the book, Realism, but I think the 800-pound gorilla is energy security. The fact is, there is a combination between BRIC countries. They're all arms customers of Russia, and they all have a huge interest in energy. Iran is also very important because the bone of contention going down will be Nabucco and the issue of South Stream. I read from one of your colleagues, and I'll read the quote and then I'll ask what you comment about it. Medvedev cannot win the battle of future pipeline routes from east to west against an alliance of the United States, the EU, and the Soviet republics. We've already lost, and I'll tell you the reason why.
Okay, before, and I'm interested, which colleague would this be?
This is Alexander Rao.
That's okay. That's fine then. Okay.
It was in a Russian magazine.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. The point is this. While we were busy fighting the war in Iraq and having an election, Putin went on a sort of signature tour to get everyone to sign up for South Stream.
Mm-hmm.
He's just got the Libyans to sign up.
Mm-hmm.
And the issue with Nabucco is, I'm not particularly good at math, but if
So can you just give us two words on each of those, Nabucco and South Stream, so we know what you're talking about?
Europe, after the Ukraine and the Belarus shutoffs, developed a policy where they would have a pipeline that would go from the Caspian Sea through Turkey into southern Europe, which would enable them to get oil from two places principally, Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan and Iran. And this is where we have a conflict of interest over the Iranian nuclear power plant, apart from where did the P2 subterfuges come from. And so the first was an alternative. However, and this was secondly after the United States had suggested the BTE and BTC pipelines in an earlier round of trying to circumvent the Russians. However, over the last 2 years, the Russians have come up with a scheme, much to the help of Chancellor Schroeder and others, of in the north creating the Nord Stream pipeline, and in the south creating the South Stream pipeline. And by doing that, eliminating Poland, Belarus, and also the Ukraine. The issue is this. 43% of the natural gas that Germany gets comes from Russia. The fact is that according to the EU's own commission of the dialogue that has occurred 5 times, that this will go up to probably around 80% by 2030. So as the old phrase goes, if you've got them by whatever, the rest will follow. And the fact is that Russia essentially has Europe hopelessly conflicted. And therefore, the issue of, say, Kyoto is secondly, it's like fiddling whilst Rome burns, in that there is a more bigger question in the short term of addressing that. For example, I would suggest a good area of dialogue is instead of letting the Iranians do a deal with the Pakistani and the Indians, ask the Russians to do Chechnya 102 and come down to Afghanistan and build a pipeline from the southern states into India and that way. I think the other thing that is misunderstood is the growth of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the fact that there is an alternative multipolarity.
It's not a real thing.
It may not be a real thing, but it provides a front through which the Russians and the Chinese can shove stuff on other people, and it has successfully done the one thing it was really meant to do, to shore up the Central Asian states. Going back to the issue of Turkmenistan and the oil and how all Central Asia, and there is a room for dialogue. There's only 80 million going to be produced this year. If the Russians get 50 million, then the South Stream gets 30 million, then the 20 million from the other pipeline that they agreed between Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan. There's no gas going to go through Nabucco. So the math doesn't add up. And so what I'm saying to you is that Kyoto is essentially, in the scheme of the next 4 to 8 years, a red herring. And the realism is to face the fact of both Europe and the United States having huge energy dependency and not being able to build them outside of 5 to 8 years and arguing about this. And I agree that there's a need for realism, but the issue with Iran is there is a way of decoupling Russia and Iran, and that is by saying, in the end, you are the biggest natural gas reserves, they are the second, we'll work with you if you don't work with the Iranians, and we'll do a thing through Afghanistan. I think that a lot of this issue assumes a world that isn't there. We have an enormous energy problem. The energy policy in the EU is dysfunctional at best. And the other fact is that your largest corporations are signed up to 2035. If you take BASF, if you take Eni, if you take Total, if you take Strat Hydro...
Got it.
They're going nowhere. So, I mean, the point is this not, and talking sort of patronizing things to either the past chairman of Gazprom or the future chairman is not going to help.
I would say I agree with a lot of that. I mean, the Shanghai thing, though, it's not real yet. It's to scare us. If they don't cooperate, thank God for Siberia, because that's the strategic interest that keeps us going. Otherwise, I think it would operationalize very quickly. But, of course, the Russians are scared. There are no people out there. There are all those resources, and the Chinese are interpenetrating Siberia at a ridiculously high rate. I'm with you and not my colleague. I like Alexander, but I think it is a big issue. The Europeans don't have an energy policy. I would be further than dysfunctional. There is not a coherent policy. To me, policy is an agreed-upon thing that is followed through in real practice. That would be my definition. They do not have that. We do not have an energy policy by those terms either, and we certainly then don't have a coordinated one if neither side has one.
Right.
So you're right. That's absolutely right. We do mention in the book, and this is more Anatole's thing than mine, but the notion of using Iran and Russia in terms of oil pipelines to put leverage on them and get the Russians more on board with Iran is to talk about energy issues with them. Also, by the way, to do the reverse and to talk about the India, Pakistan, Iranian possibilities. I think that this is indeed very important. I certainly don't think Kyoto is a red herring, but I don't think, I personally, it's not the number one issue in my life.
No.
I'm saying it is in theirs. My argument is that I'm talking about a view from Berlin. It certainly is in theirs. On that, I have no doubt. I think you are right, and that this is profoundly more important. I think the integration of these economies into a norms-based system is the game going on. And I think at the moment, how did Putin become a successful KGB officer? What issues did he deal with? He dealt with missiles, and he dealt with oil and natural gas. What is he doing now? Missiles, oil, and natural gas. He is doing exactly the same thing that he's always done. He's playing the playbook at which he is very, very good. No one is listening, and the Russians are playing in. Yes, the Russians have significant problems in diversification, in rule of law, and all kinds of things. But this is something that is underestimated when we talk about telling them what to do. One of the arguments to end John McCain's argument, let's throw the Russians out of the G8 or whatever club he doesn't want them to join, is insane. I mean, this is absolutely crazy. We need to engage. We need to be involved with. We need to talk to people. When did foreign policy become about talking only to Canada? I always thought foreign policy was about talking to people we don't agree with rather than people we do agree with. When did I miss the memo? Because the way, and your argument is certainly possible, and certainly these things are happening, And certainly we need to level with the American people and the Germans about what's really going on in the world. And part of that, and part of what this book is about, is that's why you talk to them. I don't think the Russians are going to mesmerize me when I see them, and I'm going to give up all American national interests upon entering the room. I do think if I don't know what's going on, by constant contact, make it be about Iran, make it be about Russia, make it be about Castro, make it be about Kim Jong-il, make it be about Chavez. Without constant contact, I'm giving my enemy an overwhelming advantage for him to divide me from my allies, for him to use interests. And one thing I certainly agree with you, Putin, if we don't, has a game plan.
For 20 years.
He has a game plan, and he is willing to follow it through. And as a result, let's start talking to people as grown-ups. So I don't think we're that far apart.
While we're on Russia, Dr. Lord, would you? Graham Lord is one of our Russia experts
Well,
here
John
and
is-
visits
is-
there,
is-
and fascinating to hear your take on this.
Well, there is no Russian that I know, and I know quite a few who don't believe that the oil is their big leverage. It's their way into national pride, restoration of economic and political stability, and the future position for the next at least 20 years, if not longer, from their point of view. I guess one of the questions that I have is these are realities that even the cocktail party at the Ritz-Carlton or the Hyatt, in Moscow with business leaders or academic people or people from the foreign ministry or anywhere, you hear the same thing. I mean, it's not like it's a secret. What is the barrier from either side to the realization of this just obvious thing, or what seems to be obvious even in a superficial conversation in a cocktail party in Moscow last week or 2 weeks ago? Why is that?
First, I agree with you, and talk to Russians as I do, as well as I'm sure you guys do. It's better than nukes. They say nukes have all kinds of limitations, as Dr. Kissinger pointed out. This doesn't have limitations. People need to use it. This has day-to-day stuff. This is much better than theoretically dropping megatonnage on places that you know you're not really going to do that, because as Eisenhower has said, you're not suicidal, and you don't want your society to be destroyed either. And as long as that's true, deterrence holds pretty well. Oil is different. It's actually got an applicable use. It's much better than a nuclear weapon. And the Russians now say that to me almost as a mantra, like the Chinese say they're a rising power, the Russians say oil is better than nukes. I mean, that's the standard line.
John, am I not correct in recalling a year ago, December or thereabouts, the minerals minister of Russia reported in an official document that within a decade the Russians would run out of oil, gas, uranium, gold, silver, etc. Not because they didn't have it, but because they weren't investing in exploration. And is it not true that as recently as last winter, the Russians were incapable of supplying Moscow with enough gas to keep the central heating systems going because they had to meet overseas commercial contracts?
They've got exploration and infrastructure glitches. There's no doubt about that. I think they think that this is a hiccup on the road to paradise. I think both those are true. I think everybody would agree with both those points. Whether they can or not, and I thought the Economist piece went too far, but there do need to be some rule of law basics to get investment. People want to invest in Russia for all these reasons, but you need to get that rule of law so that you don't beat up on BP because you want them back to invest in you. And in the long run, Medvedev would be, by the way, far better at doing that. I mean, saying, I'll talk the talk, we'll get you in, we won't expropriate anything because there's enough money to be made by all of us if you help us modernize our infrastructure, and if you do that. I mean, I think they'll overcome that. Right now it's a problem, but I don't think that it will be.
However, the last piece of legislation Putin signed before leaving office as president was a restriction on the percentage of ownership that was allowed for certain key industries, including energy.
Yep. Oh, they want to keep control, but they want investment.
I think that the thing is that speech that was given in December, you are correct, was part of the problem with Russia. Is that on the one side they want to be business people, but they can never forget to be politicians.
Yeah.
And at the time that speech was made, they were also talking about the fact that both Rosneft and Gazprom would control the Arctic shelf. So the whole pretext of the speech was that these people like the fault on the contract that happened with BP and the whole way that Shell behaved. It's because they're involved that we have a problem. If they're out of the way, the reality is, as we all understand, they need our money.
Yeah.
And they do. They were all about 2012 to 2014. The big fields in West Superior are going to have a So there is a sort of period of an overlap. But the reality is we can't afford them to fail. We just need to work out terms in which they will work. And each one of them, for example, both NE and NL, have now acquired licensing rights in Siberia.
Yeah.
The Odyssey, also BASF got the largest build. So there is a period where if we do have a spat with each other, it would be to our detriment more than theirs. But it could happen. But there is also the beginning of a long-term plan. If you look at the 2003 strategic plan and you look at what's going on, have they underinvested over the last 2 or 3 years? Absolutely.
Sure.
But he's got hidden away in different places. You hear in cabinet meetings about $1 trillion in funds. I mean, it's not as though they don't have the money. They want us to spend our money on it, and they want to leverage the politics of those relationships. Because if you have Total, you have the French government. If you have Statoil, you have the Norwegian government. If you have Gasunie, you have the Dutch government. And if you have BASF, and you also have Westerschall, you have the German government. And the list sort of goes on. So it's the politics that's the inhibitor. It's not they don't understand it. There is going to be a 2 or 3 year window where they could have a glitch in the road, a bump in the road. But after that, between us, we need to make sure they succeed.
You know, and I was going to say capitalism, and in our book we talk about this panacea of democratic states that we hear about. I'm not going to live in that world. I do live in a world where every major state is capitalist. We underuse the carrot of this immensely. In our book we talk about this. How do you get these BRIC economies integrated in the world you want to? The one thing you don't have to explain to the BRIC economies is the success of capitalism. They're the ones benefiting right now. You don't have to lecture them. You don't have to talk to them about it. They're the ones doing well. And you say, we want you to succeed. We want not 300 million Chinese to be middle class. We want 500, 800 million Chinese to. We want you, and as Emerson said, every man is a conservative after dinner. You're not going to be a revolutionary power if you're well-fed, you're rich, you're happy, you're going to live up to the terms of the WTO, because why not? You want the investment. You're doing well enough you can do that. And you create constituencies in these countries, and Russia and China are good examples of where there is a revolutionary power yearning at some level, a Gaullist kind of yearning to get out from under America. But if you create constituencies that benefit, prosper, do very, very well, in the long run you will change much more effectively, revolutionarily, I would argue, the interests internally. That's how you change people's mind. You don't lecture them. You say it's in your interests to behave in a way that makes you a status quo power. That's the challenge of statecraft. That's what we say in our book. That's it. That's the main one. I'd like to answer your question. I think it's a very good one. Why the heck? What's the problem? You know, the cocktail parties, the business people get it. I go to Frankfurt, as we were talking. I go to Munich. They get it. I go to New York. They get it. I went to Charlotte last night. They get it. Get it big time. No, we had a very good discussion. So why is this a problem? I'm trying to say this politely to save my burgeoning career in Washington. The people in Washington like to deal, I suppose like all of us, like to deal with realities they understand from the formative years of when they learn things. I think that's human. I don't think that's an Oliver Stone movie. I think that's reality. There is a yearning for the Cold War. Why? It's simple. There's them, there's me. It's very simple. They're evil, we're pretty good. We screw up, but we're good. And as Eisenhower rightly said as we were talking, if your 5 choices to order the world in the 20th century, real choices, not ideal Aristotelian states, real choices, are Hitler, the Kaiser, Stalin, Mao, and the bumbling old United States. Anybody not taking the United States has been sitting in a French cafe for far too long. Okay. Eisenhower was right. We're going to win if those are your choices. Draw lines and let people draw their conclusions, and we're going to win. And we were right. Now we live in a world where there isn't one power center against us, where ideology is not the driving force, where the rising powers are more nationalistic, something in the theory we should understand, but in practice we're having a hard time with, where we don't see the tying in elites as absolutely the vital thing to do, where we want to do what we used to do that worked. We want to lecture them about what they do that we don't like, and like Tom Hagen, we want to use the right language and have them come along with us because we have all the power in the room, and if not, Vito will back up what I'm saying with Luca Brazzi. He'll make you an offer you can't refuse. Okay? That's the world we want to live in. We don't live in that world anymore. And if we're going to thrive in the new one, like Michael, we're going to have to see that we still are first. We still are immensely powerful. We have immense attributes as an attracting power. Financial, cultural, personal. But we have to start seeing that soft power isn't some airy-fairy phrase. We must change how elites in the world are integrated with us. And to do that, lecturing them about human rights, for instance, is my personal favorite. Vice President Cheney didn't like the fact the Russians weren't democratic, as he says, from the safety of the president of Kazakhstan's palace. You really think the Russians aren't laughing hysterically at this?
Do you really think when Putin says, oh, democracy, you mean like Iraq? And all the Russians at the press conference laugh. Do you really think the rest of the world isn't tired of this and doesn't see it as hiding up facts? We cannot cash that check. We do not have the power to tell everyone what to do anymore. So rather than be self-defeating, my God, let's integrate these people over 20 or 30 years. That takes moral courage. That's a long-term game plan that will lead to a more humane world, a more decent world, a more just world for us and our children, and for their children, I might add. That's what ethical realism, the book, is about. Let's have moral courage and look at the world as it is, as Burke said. Let's look at the world, warts and all, and then try to make it better. Let's not imagine a fantasy world that doesn't. The problem with your question is that people who did it are living in a different era. And they are comfortable with that era, and let's face it, they were very, very successful in that era. I'm not knocking them. What I'm saying is, I love George Washington, but his foreign policy doesn't fit the time that I live in. I can revere Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower as I do, and not say that that should be the policy for today. But everyone is always fighting the last war. Everyone is always strategically doing what's comfortable that came before. And that's the personal, human, but real answer to your question.
John, as far as I can recall, none of the presidents of modern times that you've talked about was a reformed alcoholic. If you go through Alcoholics Anonymous, not that I've had that personal experience, of course, it's either you drink or you don't. You're with me or against me. You're right or you're wrong. And if you back that up with a sort of a theology he has from his religious convictions, I think you've got someone who's capable of making some serious mistakes.
There is a binary view there, yes. I think his life experiences and certainly his carousing as a youth is part of it. There is a binary view of his life. Everything is that way. I mean, I ran into trouble simply saying I think the war is a mistake. And suddenly that I'd been a Republican, that I served honorably, that I tried to tell them the truth, I was suspect. Well, why? Shouldn't you get every possible view you could possibly get and then make a decision? Washington was the best model. He had Hamilton and Jefferson in his cabinet. Can you imagine two more different ideologies? He sided with Hamilton and took Jefferson to dinner and said how important he was. That's how you run a cabinet. And with Bush, the problem is only true believers are listened to. Look who's still around. Look who's been promoted. Look what happens to people who go along. They do well. People who don't go along, like General Shinseki, who said the war will go fine, the peace will go terribly, we need 500,000 plus troops, peacekeeping is terrible. He got it right. He got it exactly right, and he was fired. He was pushed out and humiliated at his retirement party. The lesson is clear. If you go along, you will benefit. If you don't go along, you won't. That is a horrible way to run any company, let alone the country. To your question about what to expect, not much. I mean, the National Intelligence Council report, Europeans, Germans are very, very frightened about Iran and an attack on Iran. I mean, that's the conspiracy theory du jour. And there's some basis in it that Cheney people, if they could, would bomb Iran tomorrow. They would. Fortunately, the bureaucratic politics have changed. Secretary Gates would not, who is a total hero, in my view, for coming in and running the Defense Department after Rumsfeld. And I'm sure that Secretary Gates is on record as having done Baker Hamilton. I do not think he will be for bombing. Hadley doesn't matter very much, but he's not. The people around Condi Rice are not. And the CIA is not. That's what the National Intelligence Council report was about. It had nothing to do with Iran. It had everything to do about American bureaucratic politics. The CIA feel horribly burned by what happened over Iraq, where they were left holding the bag, even though all their adverbs and adjectives in their reports, they might have it. It's possible. Probably this is true, though we can't confirm it. All that was cut out, and instead General Powell tragically read declarative sentences about what was going on. And the CIA made it very clear in this report they do not want to be left holding the bag over Iran. And so I wrote an article for an Italian journal called The Empire Strikes Back. The empire doesn't want to be left holding the bag. And then senior Republicans, including Senator Hagel, said if the president were to attack Iran, we would vote to impeach him. This is from a senior, well-respected Republican. All the forces, the little bureaucratic pockets in town who opposed the president from within, began to gather around this report. I think the odds on him doing it are almost negligible now. I wouldn't say zero, nothing zero, but I think that they're almost negligible. I think we can simply run the string out. I would think before this report that may not have been true. I think they were gearing up to try to make Iran the next target. But I think now, given what's happened, and given that the president's approval rating is below that of a car salesman, He's into Charles Manson territory. 20% of the Republican Party would support the president if he voted to invade Mars. And he's at 28, so there's that 20, then 8% more of people. I don't think he can do anything. And I think the bureaucracy and the checks finally worked. They didn't work before, but they did work now, and that's better than nothing.
Russ?
John, my question is actually to bombing Iran. Okay, probably the odds on, if the economy stays like it is, the odds on probably the Democrats are going in. If history is any guide. If I was the Israelis, they see we've got 140,000 troops in Iraq. Wouldn't this be a good time for the Israelis to take out Iran?
I was in Israel beginning of the year, and I talked to a couple former heads of the Mossad. Speaking of interesting experiences, that's an interesting experience. And the Israelis know. I mean, the Israelis are aware that the Iranian crisis is a slow-moving Cuban Missile Crisis. All the outcomes are bad. That Iran being bombed, they're aware of the problems. They'll never live in peace for a generation. You know, the head of the former head of the Mossad, one of them, said that to me. We know that. We know that would be, we'd be in a state of war for the next generation at least. And they're aware that if nothing happens and Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, they are correct in that there will be a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. The Turks say at NATO meetings, if your enemy gets the bomb, why can't your friend have one? We're already hearing that at NATO meetings. The Saudis could well try to buy a bomb. The Spear of Islam, which is the Egyptian army, which has always been the biggest deal of all the armies in the Middle East, will certainly go for it. And God knows there are proliferators out there who would be interested in seeing this happen. And it isn't like the Israelis to sit back and say, I think the international order is going to look after our interests. I think that we don't need to worry about anything. Deterrence is going to work, and I'm going to trust everyone to look after us. They're aware those are their options, and they're both terrible. But at the moment, they are aware of this horrible existential choice. They want us to do more with the Europeans. No one at the moment, I will say this, is more for a common European-American position on Iran, not involving bombing, than the Israelis. No one at the moment is more. They don't want to have to make this terrible, terrible choice. And so every time I go there, they say, you get more involved with the Europeans. You drag along more Republicans. And they do say, and where the Walt Mearsheimer book on the Israeli lobby is totally crazy and wrong. And by the way, they're too realists, and there aren't that many realists. I have to be nice to all of them. There aren't that many of us out there. If we had taken out Iran, I would have time for their book. But the Israelis are the first ones to say, you idiots, you attacked Iraq, which we told you was a second-order problem, while making the dominant power in the Gulf de facto be Iran. Congratulations, the Islamic Republic. It's the Saudis, the Iraqis, and the Iranians. One of those three is going to dominate the Gulf. That's it. The Saudis can't. There aren't enough of them. They have all kinds of problems. The Iraqis could, but, well, they're not in business at the moment. So de facto, you've made the Iranians the dominant power in the Gulf. By the way, another good reason not to invade. Anybody who makes the Islamic Republic dominant in the Gulf, that's probably a bad thing. Saying that we did this, they say now, you've got to get more involved with the Europeans. You've got to push for something along the lines of investment freeze. You've got to work out a common position to try to change the calculation. We reserve the right to strike later. And they all say that, very matter-of-factly. Don't assume we won't. But right now the clock is ticking, so you get back in there. If you need us to help with contacts to other Europeans, we will. I've found them incredibly helpful. I've found them incredibly positive about the peace process for the simple interest-based reason that they don't want to forced to make this cataclysmic choice.
Are any of them considering an integrated air defense system that includes Tor, Panzer, and S-3 PMU-2s? They've already got 2 batteries of S-300 PMU-2s. The shipments must have gone because they would never have signed on to the sanctions today of the Panzers. And they've already got 29 Tors. My understanding is that the kill ratio of an F-16 is 92%. So, I mean, to me, I don't understand in any of these discourses, apart from sort of bellicose stuff, we're going to go and wipe them out, that there is no understanding of what those integrated defenses will mean. And so, if you're the Israelis, the sooner, and the other thing was 2 weeks ago in Mir Novosti, and a one-liner was, they have got the P-2 centrifuges, and they're going to build another set of facility, which will be out in March. So the ARAK facility we finished in 2009, Bashir goes operational in September. And obviously, the Natanz facility is now up to 3,000 centrifuges, with the second set of tiers of cascades being P2s, which gives you 267 days. The clock is ticking.
No, I agree with all that. The engineering glitches, as best we can tell, have been surmounted.
Well, the Russians gave them these crappy centrifuges, and they got rather upset with the Russians. That was the real reason they had the fire.
And they have had a number of the intelligence stuff I see is they did have some engineering problems, but now that has been worked out.
So that's the paradox. The fact is that the F-16s that would have the size bombs that you need to go down in bunker busters have a configuration which will be locked on quickly by either the PMUs or the TORs.
Even beyond the technology, though, let's play out what would happen if we bombed them a little bit. And I testified before Congress on that, and I just said, assume some of this will happen. All of it won't. Okay, I accept that. If we bomb them, our intelligence will not be perfect. By the way, everyone laughed in Congress when I said that. Our intelligence in the Middle East has not been perfect up to now. Everybody did. I give them credit. They all laughed. I said, so we're going to miss some spots. So you will not entirely wipe out the program. The intellectual stuff is all there. They can re-get the stuff. And so the idea that you will certainly retard the program, yes, but will you wipe it out? No. That's one. Two, they have callously put some of this stuff in high population centers. Our pilots are good, but they will miss. We will kill thousands of people. Guys like me will go in front of British TV and be said, do you love to kill children? We don't want to be a member of the Transatlantic Alliance anymore. And after Iraq, trust me, that's on the cards if we do this without any involvement with them. Three, Al-Qaeda. Finally, we have a link to Al-Qaeda. If we do this bombing, how much time do you give the kings of Oman, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Morocco? How about the Pakistani government? How about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt? Suddenly, radical Islam is on the rise everywhere, and anyone who's seen as being remotely moderate, remotely pro-American, I wouldn't give much for their chances. And that, to me, is the link to avoid. I don't want to help Al-Qaeda in any way I can. This would help Al-Qaeda. The next thing is we make a hero out of Ahmadinejad. I don't want to make a hero out of Ahmadinejad. I want people to notice that he can't run an economy and is clownish. That's what I want to have happen over time. I want to make stakeholders of the folks around Rafsanjani. I want to do that over time and lock in some interests if I can. But I sure don't want to make a hero of the mullahs.
But are they considering the fact that by next summer they will have a bomb? I mean, the whole discussion is, you've had the same basic spec that says they're 3 to 5 years away. The first time that came up was in 1998. Now,
Yeah.
I'm not particularly good at math, but 3 plus 5 means in 1998 means we've gone past that point.
Yeah.
At some point, this becomes reality.
Yes.
What I understand from the Russian newspapers was what I read. They believe they have the P2s. It will take them about 3 to 6 months to install them, and then there's 276 days, so you're ticking.
Yeah, I mean,
and then there is the other fact that there is now the Saudis have already taken the next step. They're already assuming the Iranians will have it.
Yeah.
There was a discussion. There was a Ministry of Defense leader from Saudi Arabia went to Russia and asked them.
The question is, are they going to have a nuclear device or are they going to have a nuclear weapon? And the big difference in terms of development.
They will have the materials. They will then have to re-jump the other program, but they would be within 1 year. So you're basically looking at 18 months.
I was going to say 18 months to 2 years. I think 2 years is what I'd say, but we're quibbling about our difference. I mean, that's not much.
The Shahab 3 is already prepped. It's a question of the actual way you constitute the warhead.
I think it's 2 years out, and I think that the new president, whoever they will be, so factor in how many more months do we have of Bush, was it said? Is it 8 more months? So then the next year and a half, the new president, this will be the first thing on their desk, and that is something I have been saying to people when I've been asked, that this cannot be wished away from our point of view. And then you get, if they don't do anything to the nuclear crisis within the region, brinksmanship within the region, as you say, the Saudis are logically drawing the next conclusion. There are no good outputs here, but I think one of the things to say is that we need to look, ethical realism, and the book talks a lot about, let's play these both out. Part of what we don't do is, given bad options, human beings say, let's do nothing because the options are all pretty scary, and whatever we do, it's not going to be very good. And that's true. But you have a moral responsibility, given that, to still make the best option of the bad ones that present you. We may have to decide, and we should factor in, can we live with an Iran with a bomb?
That's just what I was going
Can
to
we live
say.
with that? If they get a bomb,
What do we do, practically, policy-wise, after they've acquired a nuclear weapon? Do we engage them? Do we quarantine them? Do we try to do a non-Luger program so that we have control of their nuclear thing? Because that's the great fear for the Israelis. Many Israelis say, I'm not afraid of Iran having a nuclear weapon. The government, because they know if they used it, we'd obliterate them. You know, they're proud of their Persian culture and their Persian heritage. They don't want to be obliterated. We're not worried about them. We're worried about a loose nuke scenario where one bomb went to some crazy Republican Guard general who gave it to Islamic Jihad, Hamas, fill in the group that wouldn't care. And I said, well, then the answer is a non-Luger, a heightened non-Luger program, where you pay them to actually safeguard their facilities. You say, let's internationalize that process. Let's all help you do that. That makes perfect policy sense. Politically, our country is not ready to have that discussion yet.
But Russia has proposed that.
Yes. And the Russians are interesting because they're playing it, as they often do, both ways. You get a sense of, let's stick one in the American eye and have fun, but then you get, well, geez, we live next door to them. This isn't that fantastic. And we'll help you up to a point, but we need to do that. Yes, the Russians have proposed that, and I think quickly, whoever the new president is, you need to gear up to be ready to discuss Iran immediately, and that's what I said. Start talking to them now, both candidates, in the summer.
On that point, I understand that one of the presidential candidates, namely Obama, has brought in at least one of the internationally recognized experts on this whole subject of nonproliferation, namely the former senator of the state of Georgia, that Sam Nunn has recently been brought in precisely for this issue.
That's exactly right.
And to deal with and focus on this.
Yes.
And that's the reason.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I hear too. And an enhanced non-Luger, a one with teeth, with a lot more money, and that we talk about not just Iran. One of the ways around it is let's talk about India, let's talk about Pakistan, let's make this a global initiative. And first of all, it gets us out of the Iranian thing that we're in, this very dysfunctional. You did Mossadegh, you did the hostages, you shot down our airliner. Yeah. The reality is that if you make it more international, you get around some of the bad feeling and you involve them in. Yes, I think that will be an initiative. Non-proliferation, though, ain't going to wait. As we say in the book, given these bad options, we say very firmly in the book, I would rather live with Iran having a nuclear weapon than the problems of bombing. Not because I'm against using force in the international arena. As a realist, force has been around since the beginning. The first great book of Western civilization is the Iliad. It's about a really interesting war that will continue throughout history. I don't think we can abolish human nature, but on the other hand, I think that it is so counterproductive to the interests of the United States, and we need to begin to make that argument.
You know, John, before we leave that subject of an Israeli airstrike against Iran, you know, there are certain technical problems. One is that these Israeli airplanes would have to fly through American-controlled airspace.
Yeah.
The U.S. military knows that that kind of a strike would cause all kinds of trouble in Iraq.
Yep.
We cannot maintain the force levels in Iraq now or in the future. So, you know, there are huge power groups inside the Defense Department that are going to work against any such action on our part. So, at one level, they may want to do it for emotional reasons, but the technical side of actually delivering the weapon is not exactly an easy one.
No, and to follow that up, the neoconservative argument has almost come down to it actually is the reverse of that, building on that. The Israelis, if they do it, will do it badly. They'll have to ditch planes. They won't get very much of it done. And we'll get blamed anyway. If the Israelis were to strike, do you really think the Arab world isn't going to say it's the United States' fault? So, says Mr. Kagan, we might as well do it, since we'll be blamed anyway. This sounds like a fight with my siblings at home. The logic is, there's a reverse-inverse logic here. Because they'll ditch planes, the Israeli soldiers will be captured, they'll be torn into pieces in the streets somewhere. Rather than have that happen, and they have to fly over American airspace, in effect, recognized by the UN, the Americans are the occupying power in Iraq. They have to go over Jordan. That's going to be a picnic for the king. I'm sure there'll be no demonstrations in the streets, in anywhere.
I think we're
So that's the key.
sufficiently frightened by this scenario.
Yeah, we're having a good time.
I do have one last question. I'll give it to the gentleman on Pakistan. Am I right?
Well,
Your question.
I'm just going to say, like you said, the BRIC country does not have any common with the United States, but India and the United States do have some common because they both estimate their leaders from the beginning of the creation of the thing, from Muhammad down to Gandhi to other things. But I do want to bring it up here when you're talking about Iran, because most of the people don't know most of the Jews after Israel in Middle East, they still live in Iran. And they treated much better, and Israel, the Arabs, they treated they're treated as third-class citizens, and Jews in Iran is treated much better. When we're talking about all the nuclear things and all the things, how can America attack the third Muslim country? We attacked Afghanistan first, Iraq, and going to the third Muslim country in the last 10 years. And then you're talking about you mentioned about that spend time on the Palestinian conflict. Since Carter and Anwar Sadat signed the peace agreement, we see a lot more settlements. And Oslo agreement was more settlement. Every time that they have some peace thing happen, they have more settlements. Until they keep building a settlement, because they're never going to have any peace.
I didn't know we were going to bring this up, because this will take us the rest of the evening.
I'll try to be
This is the
pithy on
last
that.
question.
I'll try to
We
be
have to leave.
pithy on that.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, attacking a third Muslim country in a decade helps Al Qaeda recruit. I mean, that would be yet another thing. Of course it does. Of course they'll use that. Whether that's fair or unfair, it will be used because Al Qaeda are opportunistic. They'll use what they're given. Zawahiri is very clear. By the way, the Arab-Israeli conflict for Al Qaeda was always a fifth-order priority. They threw it in as an afterthought. They never cared about it. But as they tried it out, the resonance of it in the Arab world went up. So it's now the second or third thing they mention because it plays. And they are opportunistic, and it does well. It's not that the sudden wellspring of caring there. As to Sadat and who does what, I mean, I can now mention Y River and Arafat choking at the last minute on the deal, and that I don't want to play that game. Let me just say this. The problem at the moment is that both sides are too weak to enforce any kind of deal because the deal would be traumatic. Olmert's at, 13%? I mean, he's lower than Bush in the polls. And Abu Mazen could possibly disarm militias, which he'd have to do in a final settlement. Think Hamas and Gaza. He couldn't do that right now. And unless he does it, there's no peace. And if there's no peace, the Israelis won't make a deal because that's what they get out of a deal. We have to start thinking this way. Every side has to get what they want out of a deal to make the concessions that they need to make in order to survive politically. Meaning the Israelis need peace. Meaning you've got to get Hamas involved. Again, one way or the other, not because I love them, but because they have legitimacy in part of the world, and there is no deal without them. Say we did a deal with Abu Mazen. Would it stop attacks in Gaza? Would it stop Hamas from attacking Israelis? No, not at all. It would have nothing to do with that. So no, we'll get to that. Okay, one issue. So it wouldn't work. And if land is not given, contiguous bits of land, there are going to have to be settlement trades. It won't be the 67 line. It'll be 67 plus the 3 major Israeli settlements, which account for 86% of Israeli settlement population. You get rid of the rest. In return, you give a Palestinian state not a Bantustan, but a contiguous state with a capital flag in East Jerusalem and the real capital in Ramallah. You secure a link between Gaza and the West Bank that's guaranteed. The Arab League guarantee it. Potloads of money go in. Right of return is symbolic but doesn't happen. The deal's there. We all roughly know the deal. The problem is getting political people to bring their people along in non-millennial outcomes. Mr. Barghouti, languishing in an Israeli jail, is probably our best bet on the Palestinian side for the next generation. I'm actually quite hopeful about him. I think he will be Michael Collins. And I use my analogy advisedly. He'll cut the deal with the hated people. His life won't be worth very much, but you get Ireland out of the deal. It worked. But is he prepared to be Michael Collins? It doesn't end well for Michael. On the other hand, the colonels and lieutenant colonels around Rabin, the younger guys who've moved up in the Labor Party, one more spin of the wheel, and they're in power. And I think that they would be, like Rabin, ready to make a deal because it's in the Israeli national interest. Without talking in these terms, though, you won't have a deal that sticks. So we need to get beyond, you did this to me, I did this to you, and say, as Rabin did, it's in Israel. Israel's strong right now. Negotiate from strength and not from weakness. And that's what I would want for both sides. But we need to think to end differently about a very complicated, fascinating world. The good news is the book's in the second edition. And the good news is that a lot of people that were friends of mine, a lot of people went into writing it, not just the two of us. It was a lot of conversations with an awful lot of smart people over a long period of time. And you know what? To quote Mr. Dillon, the times they are a-changing.
Thank you very much.